Well, thank you, Laura, and it's great to be back here at the Press Club. As you say, I've been here many times since the election and before the election, indeed, and always happy to come along. Can I also acknowledge, though, the many colleagues I have here today: Jane Hume, Macaulay Cash, Perrin Davey, Dean Smith, Paul Fletcher, Sarah Henderson, James Patterson and Simon Kennedy, all of whom have been very closely involved in the development of the work that I'll outline today and the positions that the Coalition has taken, both on the budget and in our budget in reply. Recently, I visited a netball competition in the western growth areas of Sydney, a yearly highlight in my electorate. This year, however, the sidelines were quieter, the crowds thinner. When I asked why, the answer was simple but heart-wrenching. Many families can no longer afford organised sport for their children. This isn't just anecdotal. It's a trend we've seen nationally, where absolute necessities now take precedence over what were once considered normal activities. Persistent inflation and high interest rates are just numbers on the page until you see the impact. As prices and interest rates soar, the hard-earned money in people's pay packets buys less and less. Families struggle over having to cut back on simple pleasures like eating out, buying meat, heating their homes, or paying for participation in kids' sport. Parents swallow their pride and make sacrifices, haunted by the fear of failing to provide for their loved ones. They work extra hours and dig deeper into savings which are the foundation of their future aspirations. At a time of uncertainty with the softening job market, families agonise over how to make ends meet if the worst should happen. A whole generation of Australians haven't experienced this until now. Aspirations like home ownership, higher education and a comfortable retirement slip away, and the cycle is self-fulfilling. Each piece of economic news and false promises from politicians erode hope, leaving families feeling trapped in a cycle of despair. But the strain doesn't stop with families. 50% of small business loans are secured against the family home. Small businesses, the backbone of our communities right across Australia, are buckling under the weight of repeated interest rate hikes, 12 since Labor came to power. This is the reality of life under Labor as Australians have become poorer. Despite being promised cheaper mortgages, cheaper power bills and a lower cost of living before the election, Australians have seen nothing of the sort. Instead, they face a reality where both hope and certainty are in short supply. Now, alongside raging inflation, Australia is in an entrenched GDP per person recession. Our standard of living has fallen by more than 7% since the last election, a collapse unprecedented and unparalleled in other advanced economies. Real wages for working households have collapsed by around 9%. Our consumer confidence remains entrenched at recessionary lows. McKinsey has labelled Australia as being in a productivity recession. The number of unemployed people and the number of people on job seeker caseload are increasing. And most alarmingly, youth unemployment is on the rise. We've seen over 16,000 businesses enter insolvency since June 2022, and The Economist has declared that Australia has the most persistent inflation of any advanced country in the world. Inflation remains stubborn because our policy settings are not right. Domestic inflation is running at more than five times imported inflation, and the RBA Governor has declared that Australia's inflation is homegrown. So, given this context of persistent inflation and a household recession, the Coalition, and was myself working very closely with Jane Hume and Peter Dutton, of course, and the economic team, called for a budget that focused on three things. First, restoring our standard of living and taming inflation by taking pressure off the prices of essentials and delivering affordable energy for families and businesses. Second, restoring a pathway to prosperity that creates opportunity for all Australians, so small businesses are rewarded for their effort and young Australians have the chance to own a home. Third, restoring budget discipline and honesty, including reintroducing the Coalition's fiscal rules, which have been in place prior to this government since the 1990s. On any assessment, this budget cannot be said to have met those tests. We've now seen 3 Labor budgets, 3 chances to make the right decisions, to focus on the right priorities. Labor's only answer has been for a big spending, big government and big Australia approach. And economists from KPMG to Deloitte, HSBC, Barrenjoey to private and public sector economists like Richard Holden, Stephen Hamilton, Warren Hogan and Judith Sloan are unanimous that Labor's approach is making the situation worse, not better. The result is homegrown inflation that has made Australians poorer. Now, whilst the budget delivered just over a week ago failed to substantively address these issues and meet these tests, there are some budget measures that we can support. In addition to the measures announced by Peter Dutton last Thursday night, including initiatives focused on dealing with domestic violence, I can confirm that we will support initiatives that we judge will make our country more prosperous and more productive. These include the establishment of a financial services regulatory grid, the proposed one-stop shop for investors, streamlined foreign investment board approvals, and the development of a regulatory regime for digital assets. For some time we've been calling for these policies, but implementation will be critical. However, when it comes to the broader measures, economists are clear, as I said, that the budget is unambiguously expansionary. Labor has committed an extra $315 billion of spending since the last election, or around $30,000 per Australian household. On policy decisions, Labor is spending $4 for every $1 raised. Government spending as a percent of GDP is forecast to be at its highest level since the mid-80s outside of the pandemic. Nominal spending is growing at 16% over the next 2 financial years. That's double the rate of economic growth. Now, Labor says this is unavoidable, but included in this spending is much that we consider to be unnecessary waste, including what you saw recently with the $450 million on the failed referendum, but billions in corporate welfare, millions in grants to the union movement, funding of anti-resource project activists, more than $85 million for spin units inside the Treasurer's department, 36,000 additional Commonwealth public servants and $45 billion in off-budget spending that we've opposed through the Parliament. This kind of spending is only unavoidable to Labor. And despite inflation-fuelled bracket creep and some of the strongest commodity prices in Australia's history, Labor has wasted the windfall. Personal income taxes are 23% higher than when Labor came to office. The structural deficit is growing, leaving Australia vulnerable to future shocks. This is leading to growing debt and making commodity-driven surpluses look very short-term. None of this is helping to bring down inflation and interest rates. None of this is helping to boost productivity and capacity for sustainable growth. The government's position is clear. Their high inflation, low growth economy fuelled only by record population growth is someone else's fault. But that starting position is a cop-out. Not only did the government promise a cure, it now blames whoever it can. And that's because it misdiagnoses the problems and won't use the necessary tools in the toolkit to solve those problems. Now, we need a better way. In order to get Australia back on track, we need a back-to-basics economic agenda. An agenda that Peter and our team has been outlining over the last 2 years and will continue to through to the election. My colleagues Jane Hume, Michaelia Cash, Ted O'Brien, Sarah Henderson have outlined the principles that will guide our approach in their areas like deregulation, industrial relations, energy, education and others. And led by Peter, we've already announced policies that will make it easier to get a job and run a business by supporting pensioners, veterans and job seekers to work more without losing their payments. Restore the dream of home ownership by letting first home buyers and older women access super to develop or to help with the deposit, and by aligning migration and housing. Make our communities safe and secure with practical policies like banning sports betting advertisements during live sport, doubling the size of the Australian Centre to counter child exploitation, and making it illegal to glorify criminal activities online. Ensure our lights stay on, our manufacturers stay open, and we bring down power bills by investing in the gas we need now and into the future. Make it easier to see a doctor and access mental health and women's health treatment by supporting training the next generation of GPs and committing funding for endometriosis and ovarian cancer. We'll have more to say, of course, as we proceed through to the next election, but today I want to specifically focus on the Coalition's approach to fiscal policy, productivity, tax reform, along with housing, energy and industry policy. Now, a coalition government is putting productivity and per-person GDP growth at the centre of our economic strategy, because productivity is what allows higher wages without higher inflation. Higher wages without higher inflation. This allows both workers and businesses to flourish. We've already gone further than most oppositions, opposing more than $58.7 billion of Labor's new spending. Labor has no fiscal guardrails. It has abandoned the rules that supported every good budget since Peter Costello established the Charter of Budget Honesty, including putting a speed limit on taxing and spending through a tax to GDP cap and containing spending growth to less than growth in the economy. Committing to reducing debt and delivering structural surpluses over the medium term. The Coalition will restore these rules. The word productivity is hard to find in this budget. Labor has all but given up on productivity reform, and its revised assumption of 1.2% per annum average growth looks heroic against the experience of the last 2 years. Productivity, of course, has been a challenge across the world for many years, but not like we have seen in Australia in the last 2 years. The 5.4% drop in Australian labour productivity since Labor came to power is unprecedented in our lifetimes and unmatched amongst major advanced economies. The collapse in productivity makes sustainable increases in real wages, which we all want to see, all but impossible. Labor's workplace relations changes are making a bad situation worse at a time when workers want greater purchasing power in their pay packets and more flexible outcomes. It's taken the definition of a casual employee from 5 paragraphs to 3 pages with 15 to 25 steps just to employ someone as a casual. The Coalition will reverse this change. This is the start, not the end, of what we need to see to get productivity moving. We know productivity reform is essential to address the fiscal challenges presented by an ageing population and falling service delivery. For instance, the Productivity Commission estimates use of digital technology can deliver savings of $5.7 billion a year to the health system while providing better outcomes for consumers. But getting productivity back on track is essential because the first step of tax reform is to restrain the growth in spending. The gap between receipts and payments of $43 billion in just over a year's time is not sustainable. Of course, Labor wants to support future spending growth with never-ending bracket creep, which of course happens faster if inflation is higher. But already Australia has high rates of income tax and one of the highest company tax rates in the world. A coalition government is focused on tax reform that enhances incentives and boosts investment. Our guiding principle is that taxes should be lower, simpler and fairer, and lower taxes mean that we strive to reduce the income tax burden on families and young Australians, which also requires that governments live within their means. Simpler taxes go not just to tax design, but the complexity of the overall system, how tax is collected and how Australians interact with the ATO. Fairer taxes mean giving small businesses a fair go in ensuring we make multinationals and large companies pay their fair share of tax. By contrast, to date, Labor has shown a preference for redistribution rather than reform, and complexity over simplicity. Labor's Stage 3 changes not only broke a promise that was made over 100 times by the Prime Minister and Treasurer, they removed simplicity from our tax system. Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese are the first Treasurer and Prime Minister to add a tax bracket into law since 1993, and the first to lower the top income tax threshold since 1984. Labor's super tax change implements an unprecedented example of taxing unrealised capital gains in our tax system. But it adds complexity and inequity, unevenly and unequally taxing people on the basis of their career, their fund and their age. As a first priority, a coalition tax policy prioritises delivering for families and small businesses. Our commitment in this budget reply is to make the instant asset write-off permanent, and that's a down payment on our priority of lower, simpler, fairer taxes. This will simplify depreciation for 2.5 million small businesses across Australia, while giving them the certainty that they can plan investments on a longer-term basis rather than year to year. It builds on the Coalition's calls for Labor to restore the measure to its pre-COVID levels. It's a major commitment boosting cash flow in millions of small businesses, rewarding them for making the investment they need to grow their businesses and grow the economy. In the coming months, we'll also outline further tax reform priorities for government that we'll pursue over the medium term. Now, Australia is a proud migrant nation, and we will always remain so. But we also need to face the reality. Labor plans to bring in 1.67 million migrants over 5 years, while falling 400,000 homes short of its own target, its own promise. 1.67 million migrants is up from 1.6 at MyEFO, 1.5 at the last budget, 1.2 million from Labor's first budget, and 1.1 million when we left government. This is a government that has lost control. In just 2 years, Labor has brought in 923,000 migrants, but on the available data, there are only 265,000 new homes. This is a mathematical reality. We cannot wish our way into more housing supply. The Coalition wants Australians to be able to afford to rent and buy a home. We cannot consign people to sleeping in cars or couch surfing to get by. So to support home ownership, we have recommitted to allowing Australians to access their super to secure a housing deposit, making it easier for young couples and families to get into a house while ensuring the gains are preserved for retirement. But there is much to do to alleviate supply-side pressures, and the government is failing to shift the dial. In response, the Coalition proposes to relieve those supply-side pressures, reduce demand by first temporarily banning foreign investors and temporary residents from buying existing homes, cutting permanent migration by 25% for 2 years, followed by a gradual balancing with a great emphasis on skilled visas to support construction, and thirdly, reducing foreign student numbers in metropolitan universities to lessen rental market pressure and introduce a tiered student visa fee arrangement. This will free up well over 100,000 additional dwellings over the next 5 years, and would free up substantially more if Labor were to implement the policy now. In parallel, we'll focus on enhancing productivity across the economy and in our construction industry. We've announced policies to support more people into the workforce. We've announced that our changes to visa charges will support our regional universities as well as private colleges. And the Coalition understands that housing supply is a whole of economy problem, whilst Labor is not treating it as one. Labor's billions of unnecessary spending include initiatives like thousands of kilometres of unnecessary power lines, putting pressure on demand for construction trades that will flow through to our housing market. At the same time, Labor is refusing to list construction trades on the skilled visa lists. Master Builders analysis shows that the first tranche of Labor's IR laws will cost $15.9 billion in construction output and set Labor's housing targets back by another 15,400 homes. The total impact of the subsequent changes or stages of IR reforms will be worse. Building ministers have waved through some of the biggest changes to the National Construction Code in a decade, adding to red tape and compliance burden for projects. Labor's only solution to housing is to throw around more money and more red tape. The Coalition will make the tough decisions to remove supply pressures, reduce costs and improve productivity. Now, the pressures on construction and other costs don't just apply in the housing market. Our manufacturing and resources sectors are under cost pressure, with recent losses to those sectors, including Qenos and the Kwinana alumina refinery. It's too expensive and too slow to build and operate things in Australia. The consequence is that Labor's Made in Australia policy is throwing taxpayers' money after Labor's bad policies. The Coalition wants our resources and manufacturing sectors to thrive. These are sectors I worked in throughout my career before politics, and I know their future potential is even greater than their past achievements. But getting back on track and back to basics means making Australia a great place to invest in resources and manufacturing again. Labor's handouts mean little compared to the onslaught of red tape, taxes and regulatory uncertainty Labor has imposed on these industries, limiting access to capital through changes to the sophisticated investor test, increasing costs through the safeguard mechanism, forcing up compliance costs and uncertainty through bad workplace laws, introducing ad hoc and retrospective changes to tax laws and rules, adding $2.3 billion a year in red tape for companies to update their emissions reports, including for their customers, making gas market interventions that have made it impossible for manufacturers to renegotiate natural gas contracts, and funding environmental litigation and lawfare, which is turning the flood of major project approvals to a trickle. As the BCA, MCA and ACCI have pointed out, it is death by 1,000 cuts. Death by 1,000 cuts. Manufacturers I speak to regularly need a better business environment today, not in the future. As Industry Minister, I was proud that when we left government, there were more manufacturing businesses, more manufacturing exports, and manufacturing was a larger share of the economy than when we came to office in 2013. More investment means getting the economic fundamentals right across energy, regulation, approvals and tax. The Coalition will make Australia a better place to invest by increasing domestic natural gas production to ensure cheaper, reliable and cleaner energy, streamlining regulatory approvals and restoring the National Gas Infrastructure Plan, which Labor dropped and has refused to reinstate. And that's a plan that will fill the gap in gas supply caused by collapsing Bass Strait production. Focusing on cutting unnecessary red and green tape, particularly around approvals. This includes reducing overlap between state and federal environmental laws and unwinding the worst of Labor's inflexible workplace laws, as I outlined a little earlier. It also means securing long-term, cheap, clean power by opening the door to nuclear energy. Robert Menzies recognised the need for the Snowy Hydro scheme if Australia was to be competitive in the post-war industrial environment. Today, we need more energy, not less. If we are to secure the future capability of our manufacturing sector, that is absolutely essential. Data, AI and robotics also all require reliable baseload energy. Yet under Labor's plan, 90% of our baseload energy will leave the grid by 2035 without equivalent capacity to replace it. With 1/3 of the world's uranium, Australia has comparative advantages in nuclear that should be seen as an opportunity, not a threat. Similarly, we should take advantage of the surge in demand for critical minerals from our allies by getting those fundamentals right. The Quad, Five Eyes, AUKUS all offer opportunities for Australia's resource industry to be a critical enabler of supply chain sovereignty for our allies. We'll explore reforms that capitalise on trade agreements and further streamline our foreign investment rules with our most trusted allies to support our resources and manufacturing industries. We've seen three Labor budgets that have tried to have it both ways. Increasing spending while claiming to bring inflation down. Increasing taxes while claiming that families are better off. Increasing red and green tape while claiming businesses will invest more. From now until the election, you will see our relentless focus on getting Australia back on track by focusing on getting the basics right. This does mean a back-to-basics economic plan, fighting high prices and interest rates first, winding back regulatory roadblocks, delivering lower, simpler and fairer taxes and restoring the dream of home ownership. In the last 2 years, we've been prepared to take policy positions that are not easy, but are right. We will provide a real choice and a real contrast. We did it on The Voice. We are doing it with our plans on next-generation nuclear power. We are talking about productivity again because we have to. It's not merely about choosing a different government. It's about choosing a different future. A future where fairness, opportunity, enterprise and prosperity are within reach of all Australians, not just the select few who are aligned to the Labor Party. One that restores hope and confidence in our economy, our country and its great potential. This is what these uncertain economic times demand. This is what Australians need. Australians can't afford another 3 years of Labor.